To say we weren't alone in the Kessel would be a gross understatement. The Kessel stretched across the entire Spree forest east of a small town called Halbay, a place I had never heard of before but would never forget. The Spree was a dense forest of ancient oaks, pines, and birch trees, spanning roughly 30 kilometers from east to west, interspersed with small lakes, heathlands, and open fire breaks where no trees grew. This vast area was teeming with tens of thousands of people, as we soon realized while making our way westward deeper into the woods. The forest paths, mere dirt roads meant for forestry wagons rather than armies, were packed with people walking, limping, driving, and riding toward the west. Soldiers of all ranks and branches, Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, and Volkssturm, were mixed with civilians. The Volkssturm men, dressed in civilian clothes, carried Panzerfausts, single-shot bazookas, and rudimentary submachine guns made for their use. Some troops were wounded, limping along on crutches or hitching rides on any vehicle that would take them, tanks, trucks, or horse-drawn carts. Men slept on the decks of panzers, crawling along the narrow roads, sat on turrets, clung to the track covers, or even to the barrels, their heads nodding as they dozed upright. Alongside the troops there were civilians, elderly men, women of all ages, and numerous children, some riding or begging for space on the military vehicles. Many civilians were armed with shotguns, pistols, or carbines, and walked alongside the soldiers carrying only backpacks and weapons. Others tried to move their belongings in handcarts or wagons drawn by horses or oxen. Some brought their animals, and our panther crew often had to dismount to clear paths through clusters of cows, pigs, or goats, driven by elderly farmers with sticks. Following our 2 surviving panthers were SS King Tigers that offered rides to SS men only, dozens piled on each tank, their camouflage blending well against the forest foliage and dappled sunlight. Progress was painfully slow along the narrow path, which was clogged with obstructions and abandoned vehicles. Passing between the ancient oaks, we witnessed grim scenes. Several times, Soviet aircraft flew low over the trees, firing indiscriminately into the forest below. During one strafing run, a volley of cannon tracers sliced through the branches, snapping off heavy limbs and igniting them. A large branch crashed onto a family pushing a handcart, a mother, grandmother, and children, killing the 2 women. Their bodies lay in the undergrowth, while the dazed children took a few items from the cart and rejoined the crowd, vanishing into the endless column of foot traffic. Katyusha rockets exploded above, sending shrapnel and splinters of wood down upon us, injuring people clinging to the vehicles. A civilian woman guiding me was struck by a wood splinter in her arm. I handed her a bandage from our field kit, and she wrapped her arm, fighting back tears. In the afternoon, we halted to add oil to the engines and let them cool, as the slow pace was dangerously overheating them. We moved our 2 panthers off the main path, clearing a small area by bulldozing a few saplings to avoid disrupting the overhead canopy that shielded us. When the panther's engine shut down, the metal rang out as it cooled, and the mighty Maybach unit sighed quietly in the shade. The King Tigers pulled up beside us, their engine decks emitting a haze of oily smoke as crew members opened the engine grills to help the motors cool down. The Panther and Tiger engines were similarly constructed, each motor encased in a reinforced armored steel compartment, with radiators housed in separate steel boxes on either side. This setup was meant to protect the engine from water in case they had to ford rivers, since few bridges could support the Panther's 48 tons or the King Tiger's nearly 70 tons. However, this protective design also led to frequent overheating, with engine fires being a common issue. After using the last of our oil, we informed the infantry traveling with us that we would be pausing for an hour. This gave us a chance to check our track links and running gear, while the infantry spread out on the forest floor among the leaves and brush. On the edge of our temporary clearing, some men were inspecting a parked vehicle, a German Horsch staff car, the kind used by senior officers. They called us over to see what they had found. Inside, an SS officer sat slumped in the driver's seat, his head against the door looking through the windshield. He had taken his own life with a shot to the temple, the pistol still in his hand, and fresh blood dripping from the wound. Beside him was a woman in civilian clothes, dressed elegantly in a summer dress and hat, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes closed, a cigarette still between her lips. In those final days, the SS feared the approaching Soviet forces immensely. After years of war, the destruction left in their wake, and harsh policies, the SS knew mercy would not be given. Many saw it as a preferable fate to meet their end on their own terms rather than face the Soviets. There was nothing we could do for the two in the Hor. We siphoned their nearly full gas tank and distributed it among the tanks. By the time we moved out again, the forest had deepened into shadows. Every bend in the track held scenes of confusion and suffering. Civilians called out to us repeatedly, asking which way to go, pleading for rides on our tanks. Some held their children up, showing how sick or tired they were, and explaining how far they had walked, often over 100 kilometers from the east. We couldn't help them, and sometimes our gunner had to use a shovel to push back desperate men trying to climb onto the hull. As evening approached, my civilian guide told me we had 3 or 4 kilometers left before reaching the central part of the forest. "We'll need to be careful there," she added. "We?" I asked. "I assume I can stay with your tank," she replied. "I've been helpful to your unit." "How's your arm?" "It's painful," she admitted. "I wish I had some morphine." "We've used it all," I said. She looked at me sharply, pain and frustration in her gray eyes. "I don't believe you," she whispered, clutching her injured arm. "You're saving it for yourselves." I didn't reply. The Panther came to another stop at a crossroads, congested with carts and even a civilian bus filled with the wounded. For the first time, I looked at her carefully. She was perhaps 40, her gray eyes bright with anger and pain. "Just a little morphine," she repeated, softer this time. "Please." In front of us, an ambulance cart had stopped. Its horse had collapsed, and the wounded on board cried out as they were jostled by people trying to pass. I turned to her and said, "I used the last of our morphine 2 days ago." One of my men had been struck by a shell fragment, right in the kidneys. It took him 3 long days to pass, though we did everything we could to ease his pain. When we finally ran out of morphine, he pleaded with me to end it. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, chastened. "Did you?" she asked quietly. "Yes, I shot him in the head," I replied. "I hope if I ever end up in his situation, someone would do the same for me. But listen, you've been helpful. I'll get you morphine if we come across any along the road." The sounds of battle grew louder to the south and east. Even within the Kessel, the Soviets were pressing in, their forces advancing in groups of 2 or 3 panzers testing our defenses. Infantrymen sprinted back from the perimeter, shouting warnings. The forest thinned as we moved along, occasionally giving us glimpses of Soviet aircraft prowling above the trees. We layered additional branches over our hulls and turrets, keeping one eye on the sky, and only advanced when absolutely necessary to avoid being exposed. At one open patch in the forest, we encountered a unit of 3 Jagdpanzers, low-profile tank destroyers built on the Panzer IV chassis. We halted behind them while they scouted the clearing ahead for any sign of planes. The first Jagdpanzer pushed forward across the open gap and continued into the thicker trees beyond. The second followed, surging along the track. The third, however, hesitated, scanning the sky as our troops yelled at it to move or clear the path. The commander finally gave the signal, and just as the Jagdpanzer edged out onto the clearing, the shadows of Soviet Sturmovix darkened the ground. The Jagdpanzer accelerated, hoping to reach cover, and made it halfway before a hail of rockets burst down through the canopy. Branches shattered, and one rocket struck the Jagdpanzer square on its flank, lifting it momentarily before it crashed back down and swerved off the road. Smoke poured from its engine as it lurched into the trees, tipping onto its side and snapping branches as it went, exposing the road further. Flames poured from the Jagdpanzer as it lay twisted amidst the broken wood, its upper deck glaring through the breach in the tree cover. Realizing the risk, civilians, soldiers, and medics alike scrambled off our Panther, fleeing into the dense woods for cover. Only the civilian woman clung on, seemingly paralyzed with fear, as I scanned the sky for signs of another attack. Seeing nothing, I yelled to my driver, "Drive like the devil!" It was a gamble, but staying meant a greater chance of being caught in the open. I dropped down into the turret, and my driver thrust the Panther forward, pinning me back against the wall. Through the periscopes, trees flashed by, and I caught a glimpse of the burning Jagdpanzer and one of its crew, struggling to escape the hatch, his entire torso aflame. Ahead, the road erupted in a rain of rockets, earth and shrapnel exploding across our path and pelting the Panther's hull. We surged through the smoke as debris hammered against us. The tanks behind us took no pause, and within a minute, both our Panthers and the two King Tigers had crossed the clearing, diving into the relative safety of the dense forest. We paused to take stock, and I climbed through the cupola to inspect the hull. Around us, troops and civilians slowly regrouped, emerging from the woods and following our tracks. On the engine deck of my Panther, the civilian woman lay sprawled across the metal grills, her clothes stained dark with oil and frayed from rocket shrapnel. Her eyes were open, and though still breathing, her chest wounds produced a faint hissing sound with each labored breath. Carefully, I lifted her and passed her down to the waiting civilians. The movement made her wince, and she whimpered softly, her eyes rolling back. The capo approached, hands on his hips, and looked down at her. "We have to keep moving. The skies are swarming with Jabos," he said, casting a wary eye upwards. "I promised her morphine," I replied, "and now we're out." "She's fading," he said. "She helped us find this path," I reminded him. With a sigh, he reached into his own Panther's medical kit, found the last morphine ampule, and administered it. The woman's pain softened as the drug took effect, and she weakly reached into her pocket, pulling out a small photograph that she pressed into my hand before going still. She had mere minutes left, but at least now she was in a more peaceful state. Curious, I looked at the photograph. It depicted a young woman, likely her daughter, resembling her in those younger years. I pocketed the picture as we heard aircraft roar over the treetops, the road we'd just crossed erupting in fiery bursts. As we moved forward, the track became pocked with bomb craters, forcing us to navigate carefully between them amid a jam of other vehicles. Makeshift wooden bridges patched many of these craters, basic structures cobbled together by the Hueys. These men, the Hilfswilliger or Willing Helpers, were Soviet soldiers who had surrendered in 1941 and 1942, back when German victories seemed inevitable. They had faced a stark choice: internment in open prison camps, mere squares of barbed wire with no shelter or provisions, or survival as laborers in our ranks. In those early camps, survival had meant finding food among weeds and relying on rain for water. Tales circulated of mass deaths from starvation and disease. Some said up to 2 million had perished. Many men turned to the German side, becoming Hueys, laboring to earn the basics, food rations and a blanket each night. By 1943, after the Battle of Kursk, Soviet troops became less willing to surrender, and those who did often refused to work with us. They feared the punishment awaiting their families if they were captured. Now the remaining Hueys were trapped between forces. To stop working for us meant losing their rations and potentially their lives. But if captured by the Soviets, they and their families faced execution. In this impossible situation, some Hueys sought escape through suicide, while others carried on, performing their tasks with the grim resignation of the condemned. We soon encountered a group of about 10 Hueys, wearing mismatched uniforms and civilian clothes. Thin and hollow-eyed, these men had weathered years of hardship, their expressions fixed in stoic fear, pushing forward with a quiet, methodical determination that only those facing the certainty of their fate could understand. As we passed a 75mm PK gun crew, struggling to haul their weapon out of a bomb crater, I noticed their tractor lying in a ditch, smoke pouring from its engine. Nearby infantry rushed past, shouting that the Reds were close. Suddenly, the trees on our left crashed down, revealing the green hull of a T-34 barely 50 meters away. Another Soviet tank loomed behind it, with Red infantry climbing over the fallen trees to reach us. Civilians scattered, screaming, terrified by the sudden appearance of the enemy they'd heard so many tales about. Meanwhile, the Hueys, German-assisting Soviet POWs, ducked into the crater, leaving the pack gun abandoned at the edge while its crew scrambled for their carbines. The civilians scattered, and I dropped into the Panther's turret, ordering our tank to halt, turn, and prepare to fire as soon as possible. We were locked in a deadly race to fire the first shot. In tank combat, the first strike often decides the outcome. If it hits, it can immobilize the enemy or stun the crew, buying precious seconds for a second shot. Our Panther's slow-turning turret became critical. Unlike other tanks, our commander couldn't traverse it, leaving the gunner to make fine adjustments himself, lining up the target while I coordinated the tank's movement. Luckily, we were stationary, and the T-34 was struggling over debris. Our shot rang out, and the tracer flew in a red arc, hitting the T-34's turret below its gun mantle. I watched through the periscope as it recoiled, crashing into an oak tree before its turret erupted in flames, scattering the nearby Soviet infantry. Yet even as the turret blasted off, crushing some of the soldiers below, the remaining infantry advanced, undeterred. We opened fire with the bow machine gun, cutting down many of the Reds while my gunner aimed at the second T-34, struggling over the trees to reach us. Our shot missed, deflecting off its sloped armor in a burst of metal fragments. Just as my loader slammed in the next round, the T-34 fired, but instead of a shell, it released a long stream of burning liquid, an inferno aimed directly at us. It was a Flampanzer, a flamethrower tank, and its fiery jet cut through the forest, catching one of its own infantry who ignited instantly. His comrades scattered, flanking us from the trees. The dense smoke from the flamethrower made it impossible to see the tank for a few seconds. My gunner stayed focused, predicting where it would emerge, while I ordered the loader to ready a high-explosive round to target the flamethrower nozzle. To our right, the Paquet gunners exchanged fire with Soviet infantry, reinforced by a small group of German soldiers from the forest. Of the thousands likely hiding in the nearby woods, only about 50 emerged, ready to defend the Kessel. Then the Flampanzer lunged from the smoke, spitting more fire wildly across the trees. Flames shot past us, but I knew that if they reached our rear deck, the blaze would find our engine grills and ignite an explosion in seconds. Trapped within the crew compartment, we knew that if the Russian flames breached the hull, we'd have no time to escape. Already the stench of incendiary fuel seeped in, and we could feel the intense heat radiating through our armor. In haste, we fired a round at the T-34's turret, but it glanced off without penetrating, sending the Flampanzer lurching forward as it angled its flame projector to rain fire directly onto us. But before it could unleash its attack, our high-explosive shell struck the turret. The explosion wrenched off the projector, sending it spinning into the trees, trailing flames. Fuel gushed from the damaged gun mantle, and as the T-34 began to reverse, we hit it again in the same spot. The second shot triggered an immediate and catastrophic reaction. Flames erupted from the turret hatch, shooting high into the air, and within moments the tank was engulfed in its own fire, wedged between burning trees. We could only imagine the hell inside the T-34's hull as its fuel exploded, consuming everything inside in a towering blaze. With their tanks destroyed, the Soviet infantry began to retreat, though they kept firing at our troops as they pulled back. Near the crater where the damaged PAK gun lay, they noticed a group of Hueys, Soviet POWs, forced to work for us. Our troops seemed to hesitate, watching from cover as the Russian soldiers surrounded the Huey's crater, disabled the gun with grenades, and opened fire. I shouted to a nearby Feldwebel to intervene, but it was too late. The Reds finished their task and withdrew into the trees, shouting in triumph as the forest fell quiet save for the crackling of the burning T-34. When I asked the Feldwebel why his men hadn't defended the Hueys, he shrugged. "We have too many Hueys in the Kessel as it is. They're becoming a problem. If the Reds solve it for us, so be it." As we moved on, I glanced down into the crater where the bodies of the Hueys lay in a grim heap beneath the ruined pack gun, wisps of smoke still rising from the bullet wounds. In the Halbe Kessel, the dead were left where they fell or tossed into the woods, marshes, or craters along the roadside. The march westward continued, slow and solemn in the fading light, the heavy atmosphere etched with the sights, sounds, and acrid smells of the battlefield. The desperation of the Kessel burned itself onto our senses as we pressed onward into the evening. Inside the Panther turret, the air was stifling, thick with the fumes of fuel and explosives as the transmission rumbled beneath us. To relieve the oppressive heat, we emptied spent 75mm shell casings from the collection box and tossed them out through the loader's hatch at the rear of the turret. We left all hatches open to ventilate, though the Panther's lack of a loader's roof hatch made it hard to keep air circulating. With my torso through the commander's cupola, I glimpsed 2 SS King Tigers lumbering behind, carrying exhausted troops, and our Panther itself was packed with wounded soldiers clinging on wherever they could. The Kessel was a landscape of chaos and desperation. Explosions echoed around us as artillery shells sporadically burst overhead, showering debris and keeping everyone on edge. Maneuvering down a narrow road, we bulldozed past abandoned Luftwaffe trucks, their siphon hoses still hanging, showing signs of looting in the scramble for gasoline, water, and ammunition. Among the spilled cargo were church relics, paintings, and silverware, cast aside as survival needs took precedence. A massive crater nearby was filled with the bodies of fallen soldiers and civilians alike, all thrown together without ceremony, the odor of decay adding to the grimness. In a nearby marsh, vehicles had been pushed off the road to make space, and I spotted a Jagd Panther tank hunter, sunken and lost to the bog. Through the trees, an open meadow held the remnants of an American Flying Fortress bomber, crash-landed and partially buried. Tempted to search it for supplies, we watched as artillery shells rained down on it, exploding its fuselage in a cloud of twisted metal. When the shelling moved into the forest around us, we were surrounded by the screams of civilians caught in the blasts. As the barrage passed, the forest was left littered with burning vehicles and the fallen, while our column reformed and trudged onward. Everywhere people, both civilians and troops, begged for rides, for water, food, and medicine, with most no longer knowing where to find their units or loved ones. Discipline was breaking down. Desperation was a currency as valuable as gold. Money had become worthless in the Kessel. I saw a staff officer offer a wallet of Reichsmarks to a Hanomag driver, hoping to secure a ride. The driver cursed him off, but accepted a civilian couple who offered a gold ring in exchange. In the Kessel, only the essentials, gasoline, food, morphine, held any value. Order was fraying, and any attempt at discipline was harsh and arbitrary. Passing a makeshift maintenance workshop set up beside a barn, I spotted a steel gantry, a towering frame on wheels used to lift the heavy turrets and engines of our tanks. Relief washed over me. The final drive on my Panther was nearing the end of its life, and I hoped this stop could mean a chance at repairs. The Panther's power chain, designed to last 800 kilometers, had already surpassed 900, thanks to our grueling push into the Kessel. Oil was leaking from the forward hull casing, and I could hear the transmission slipping as the driver fought to control it. If the system jammed in the middle of combat, it could end everything for us. I scanned the area for a spare part or some miracle of maintenance and saw another Panther under a gantry crane with 3 mechanics standing on its forward hull, peering at the transmission cover. I knew the routine well. The Panther's forward transmission, located in the front hull and powering the front wheels, required mechanics to unbolt a rectangular plate from above the driver and radio operator stations. With this plate lifted by the crane, the crew could access the transmission. Mechanics would carefully guide the bulky replacement piece down into the hull, a millimeter at a time, ensuring it fit. Meanwhile, they would open the rear engine deck, remove armored grills, and crane out the Maybach engine to install a fresh one. Skilled mechanics could complete the entire job within a day, prepping the Panther for another 800 kilometers of service. But as I approached, something felt wrong. I didn't see any spare parts lying around, as one would expect in a service area, just the Panther, the crane, and 3 men on the hull. Then I noticed ropes stretching from the men's necks up to the crane's steel girders. They were not mechanics ready to work. They were Wehrmacht mechanics, hanging by ropes with signs around their necks. This man helped the Reds by refusing to aid the Waffen-SS. The Panther roared to life, spewing smoke as it backed up, leaving the men swaying. I recognized the markings of the SS Panzer Corps as the tank moved away onto the forest track, indifferent to the grim scene it left behind. Ravens were already circling the crane. In the Kessel, there was no room for protests, complaints, or debates on martial law. Survival meant moving forward, keeping your head down, and listening to the clanking of your transmission over the sounds of despair all around. Navigating by shouting out requests for directions, we wound our way into an area where tanks and armored vehicles were scattered under ancient oak trees. I saw a trio of Hetzer tank destroyers, their crews busy with repairs, and a unit of battered Panzer Vs. These panzers were in dire shape, with torn mesh armor screens and engine hatches billowing smoke. One was even being towed by a captured T-34 chassis stripped of its turret and repurposed as a tractor. That rugged Russian tank, reliable despite changing hands repeatedly, kept running without complaint, serving whoever drove it. We maneuvered past the abandoned vehicles, carrying our wounded and a growing line of foot soldiers trailing behind us, until a solitary Kettenhund military police officer directed us to a clearing where we could gather information. By the time we reached this spot, darkness was settling in, and our engines were once again overheating. The SS King Tigers moved slowly ahead, led by guides on foot using cable phones to communicate with the drivers, trying to locate their unit within the forest to the north. The capo and his gunner joined other panzer officers for a discussion while we opened the engine grills on my Panther, checking the Maybach as it gurgled and clattered in the fading light. Around us, the atmosphere shifted as people on foot began to prepare for the night. Many seemed desperate to drown out their fears, and amidst the cries of the wounded, the sounds of impromptu drinking parties floated on the breeze, punctuated by mournful singing and the clinking of bottles. Some couples slipped into the shadows, their fervent encounters echoing a collective longing for distraction from the Kessel's horrors. One Luftwaffe flak worker, indifferent to her surroundings, accepted a Waffen-SS man right on the ground between the trees, her eyes glazed as she gazed up over his shoulder. We shook our heads at her boldness, yet who could truly blame her? With life hanging by a thread and bodies vulnerable to damage, what did it matter? A parachute flare ignited high above, casting a ghostly light over the scene, illuminating the waiting SS men behind the one fortunate enough to have found solace, a grim testament to the Reich's decline. How much further could it sink? It was around 11 p.m., the sky almost as bright as day from flares drifting overhead and lines of tracer bullets twisting through the air, striking the trees in the distance. The sounds of combat intensified around the perimeter of the Kessel, with the Russians tightening their grip. Groups of wounded soldiers limped past, pleading for medical attention, while civilians pushed their injured loved ones in handcarts, frantically warning us that the Russians were advancing ever closer. One civilian woman took her own life with a pistol, her body lying among the trees, near the brazen Luftwaffe girl and the eager SS men. The capo returned with the leaders of other armored units gathered in the forest. They stood near our Panther for a moment, speaking in hushed tones before dispersing. He then called us together, away from the milling foot soldiers, between our two Panthers, with their imposing wheels on either side of us. Our drivers instinctively ran their hands along the track links, gauging the tension as a green flare erupted above the treetops, casting a jagged light across us as it descended. "The Kessel is small but crowded," the capo stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "There could be 100,000 troops in here, along with 20 or 30,000 civilians. The Reds have fresh troops surrounding us with new armor, and they're pushing in constantly. In a day or two, the Kessel will surely fall." He glanced at a group of women and children asleep in a truck wedged between two trees. The children sprawled atop the women appeared ghostly in the swaying green flare light, their bodies already resembling the stillness of the dead. "Those who can break out will do so now," at midnight. "In 45 minutes, Herr Lieutenant?" I asked, my concern over our dwindling fuel evident. "In 45 minutes," the capo confirmed. "We will fight through a place called Halbo, the village immediately to the west. The Reds hold the area, but we have a significant concentration of panzers in a small zone. Our plan is to punch through Halbe into the flatland on the other side and cross the north-south Autobahn at Baruth or nearby. From there, it's only 40 or 50 kilometers to the 12th Army positions, who are ready to receive us. Once we break through the 12th Army corridor, we'll reach the Elbe River. We know that the Americans hold the west bank of the Elbe, and if we are captured, it will be in the American zone. We understand the stakes. Germany will need us after the war, and falling into Russian hands means we may never see our homeland again." As a green flare illuminated the treetops, the sound of descending shells pierced the air, and we instinctively threw ourselves flat between the Panthers, relying on their steel to shield us from the explosions. Glancing up, I witnessed a truck full of women and children disintegrate, bodies flung into the air amid the flashing light. I pressed my face into the ground, my fingers digging into the earth as the Panthers rocked under the bombardment, the acrid scent of smoke and explosives enveloping us, mingling with the screams of the wounded over the echo of detonations. When the artillery finally ceased, I stood up, dreading to see the wreckage of the truck. The capo was already on his feet, staring at the destruction. Dismembered civilians lay scattered in dark pools beneath the eerie green light of another flare. Nearby, the Luftwaffe woman and her SS lover lay dead, their bodies twisted together in a smoldering heap, her eyes still wide and vacant. We started the panzer engines. Our path to the breakout point was lined with Kettenhund military police and panzer officers wielding masked flashlights, forcibly directing foot traffic away from the forest tracks. I witnessed one Kettenhund kick an infantryman aside, then shoot him with his MP-40 when the man attempted to return to the road. Carts and wagons had been overturned to clear the way, their civilian owners watching us in silence under the flare's glow and the distant explosions from the perimeter. We passed beneath an oak tree ablaze like a brazier, surrounded by the bodies of wounded troops who had sought shelter there when a shell struck. Our route was once again illuminated by the flames of a burning aircraft that skimmed the treetops before crashing to our right in a massive fireball resembling the morning sun. Following two Hetzer tank destroyers, we bulldozed one that had been immobilized by a fallen tree, pushing it out of our way with our front plate as we pressed on. Behind us lay a chaotic mix of armored vehicles racing for the breakout point, and further back a dense column of foot soldiers and civilians in wagons, cars, and trucks, all desperate to follow the armored spearhead through Halbe and westward. The breakout plan was rough, a necessity with the Reds tightening their grip around us minute by minute. The initial assaults would be led by the King Tigers of the SS Panzer Corps, supported by the remaining armor, artillery, and panzer grenadiers from the 21st Panzer Division. "The SS boys are eager to be the first ones out of the Kessel," the capo had remarked with a wry smile. "They know there's no prison for them, not even in Siberia. Any SS soldier caught by the Reds is either shot or beaten to death. We can count on them to lead the way." I could see the flashes of our artillery firing through the trees on either side of the road. The gunners had orders to fire off all their rounds, then destroy their gun breech blocks and head for the breakthrough point on foot. Their trucks' fuel tanks had been drained to supply gasoline for the panzers. Ahead of us was the capo's Panther, its exhaust trailing flames, leading us toward the stretch of open land that led directly to Halbe. Fighting had already erupted out there, beyond the forest's edge. Bursts of flame, drifting flares, and the starburst explosions of rockets illuminated the heath in a chaotic dance of light. I slid down into the cupola, sealed the hatch, and braced myself as we lurched out of the last forest track and onto the heath. Through the periscopes, I spotted the church tower of Halbe, starkly visible against a backdrop of flames. Whatever was unfolding in that small town, it looked like a medieval inferno, full of sparks and raging fires. Our Panthers surged across the heath, crashing through stationary cars and trucks strewn across the ground. The overhead flares created a shifting light that fluctuated between dusk and bright sunlight, forcing my eyes to constantly adjust. In one blinding flash, I saw the capo's panther roll over a motorcycle and sidecar, sending the entire machine flying through the air behind us. The motorcycle tumbled toward us, momentarily blocking my view as it smashed onto our turret before vanishing. We suddenly dipped into a defile, and I muttered a prayer that it wasn't an anti-tank ditch. As we clawed our way up the other side, I saw tracer rounds whiz past us, and then we took 2 hits on the glacis plate as we leveled out. There were red pack guns positioned around the village, and we faced a choice: halt and fire at them or keep moving to avoid becoming a stationary target. The capo had no doubts. I watched his panther sway and lurch as he zigzagged toward the town, tracer rounds flying past him with every turn. With only a few hundred meters left, we slowed down to navigate between craters and ditches that would surely trap us. In this zone, we encountered a king tiger immobilized in a crater, its nose buried deep, clearly stuck. Its massive gun barrel was elevated, providing fire support against the packs, and it was unleashing a torrent of fire on those positions. As we passed the stranded panzer, I saw it get hit on the side of the turret by a tracer round, followed by another. The enormous machine lurched violently, its hatches bursting open to release plumes of flames, until a final explosion from within blew the entire turret off the hull, sending a massive sphere of red flames boiling upward. Illuminated by this inferno, we quickly became an easy target, but within moments we were on top of the surviving Russian Paki guns, too close for them to engage us effectively. The packs were entrenched along a series of emplacements before the town, and the initial wave of King Tigers had already decimated their numbers. In the chaotic glow of the flares, I noticed several guns crushed beneath the tracks of advancing panzers, their barrels and wheels reduced to twisted metal, with their crews scattered around them. One PAK remained intact, surrounded by a few surviving gunners, so we halted with a loud screech of metal, allowing our gunner to take aim. At a range of 50 meters, we fired one high-explosive round, obliterating the emplacement. Some of the red gunners, silhouetted against the flames from the town behind them, raised their hands in surrender. My gunner mowed them down with his coaxial MG, and we rolled forward into the outskirts of the town itself.